everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Confessions of an IT Business Owner. Again, we are so excited to have you guys joining us today. I'm Taylor Thorson, back again with Ryan Goodman, podcast host and president of ConnectBooster. Today we have a one-of-a-kind episode for you guys with Frank Vitagliano. He is the CEO of the Global Tech Distribution Council and, fun fact, inducted into the IT Hall of Fame.
Yeah, that was amazing.
Kind of a big deal.
Yeah, along the likes of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs.
Cool.
Incredible. What an honor to be able to interview him and have him be on the show. And we talked a lot about Frank's 30-year career in IBM, as well as then near the end of his career before he became the CEO of the GTDC, worked at a smaller MSP. So he got to understand the distribution model for many years on the enterprise side, but then really got to mix it up on the smaller side of that business, which made a big impact in his career. The other thing that he had done was we talked a lot about the infrastructure that distribution has invested in over the last 30 years and how critical that was through the work from office to work from home transition we had all just gone through.
Yep, that no one saw coming and had to pivot quickly.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for joining and enjoy.
Frank, thank you for getting on the call, getting on the podcast today. Confessions of an IT Business Owner. Like our trend as of the last few podcasts, of course, we're tying people up on Friday. What the heck's wrong with us over here?
Yeah, that's okay. I'm happy to do it. Any day works.
I appreciate that.
It wasn't Friday afternoon, so that was good.
Yeah, that's good. All right, at least we're in the morning, right? All right, I get a little bit of grace. I'm gonna before we dig into all of the meat of the conversation, let's say, you're a big sports fan, right? At least that's what I understand. What teams do you follow?
Well, I grew up in Boston.
Okay.
So I follow the Red Sox and the Patriots, as you would expect.
Absolutely.
And I've been living pretty much in Atlanta for the last 30 years or so. So I've kind of become a little bit of a Georgia sports fan. But my daughter went to the University of Georgia, so I follow their football team pretty regularly.
Yeah.
So so between those, that kind of keeps me busy.
That's awesome. I had a chance to go to Fenway. It was one time several years back, but what an iconic place.
It is, and there's been discussion about ripping it down and starting over, and it's like, why would anybody even think about that? Right?
No, that's.
But yeah, it is. I get up. I try to get up once a year when I'm up there. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Yep.
Now, another fun fact. I was just doing a little bit of research. Now, you have some pretty insane company around an honor that you've received a few years ago with the likes of Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. Being inducted into the IT Hall of Fame. That's incredible.
Yeah, that was a nice honor. That and it's sort of recognized. I've been in the industry, as you probably know, for quite some time. Probably going on, I don't know, 35, 40 years, something in that range.
Right.
And the one thing I did is I decided to kind of get into an area that I really enjoyed and stay there. And a lot of folks don't do that. A lot of folks are in it. And so I worked for IBM at the time. That was my first company I started with. And, I had a number of different opportunities to work in a number of different areas. But I ended up over in the channel area. And back in the days when the channels were really just kind of getting started, this was, back in the mid 80s, beginning of the IBM PC, kind of stuff, right? And I've been in it ever since. And so where there's a lot of guys that jumped in and out and done different things, I stayed in it. Yeah. And I developed a lot of relationships, and I'd like to think a lot of expertise. And it was fun. And it was a great spot to be in. And over the years, I stayed very engaged, and I was lucky enough to get on it with that a few years ago. So it was great.
that is an incredible story. So you had mentioned IBM. Was that your first job in technology?
Yeah.
Okay.
I actually started. I actually started in high school. I was a senior in high school. looking, for kind of a work study kind of a deal. I went to work for IBM in the mailroom,
Okay.
and they at the time they had a tuition refund program. And I grew up, as I mentioned, I grew up in the Boston area, kind of lower middle class. My father was a truck driver.
Sure.
And so I realized that it was a good opportunity to get a tuition-free education if I stayed with IBM. So I got
Yeah.
offered a full-time job. It was, it was in kind of in a distribution center kind of an environment, and went to school at night, went to Northeastern at night through the IBM tuition refund program. So they basically paid for my education.
Yeah.
Took a little longer than, normal, and it wasn't a traditional college experience that a lot of people would have.
Right.
But it worked out great. And so I stayed. So I stayed with IBM for 33 years.
Wow.
Technically started at 17, left at 50, and then went off and did a couple of other things after that.
So I also had on my list here in doing some research, you had some experience with Dell, Juniper, and Computex. What are some of the accomplishments that you're most proud of? Obviously, you had a long tenure at IBM, but what are some of those accomplishments that you're, really most proud of in that time?
Yeah, I tell you, when you think back after all these years, it gets kind of blurry, in terms of what you did, what you didn't do. I mean, at the end of the day, for me, what I'm most proud of is just developing, good, strong, enduring relationships.
Yeah.
And you don't do that over a long period of time unless you treat people the right way, unless you're honest, trustworthy, etc. You don't last for 45 years or whatever, in any industry. And I remember early on, I had a mentor of mine, somebody who was very influential to me, tell me, at the end of the day, when it's close to being over and you're thinking back, you won't remember the meetings, you won't remember the events. What you remember is the relationships, right? That's the part that will matter and that will endure. And for me, that was the most significant piece. Because any of us that are in this space, once you take a job, once you agree to, you're if you're going to do it right, you're going to put everything you have into it. So you're working 12, 15, 18-hour days, you're traveling, you're doing all that. It all kind of is a blur, but at the end of the day, it's the relationships that, to me, that mattered the most. So I'm most proud of that.
That's cool. That's cool. As well as some good advice in there. Relationships are key.
They are, particularly in the channels business. It's a surprisingly small community.
Correct.
I mean, you've got the vendor piece of it. Mm-hmm. You've got the solution providers, the distributors kind of in the middle. Of course, none of us would be here if it wasn't for the end users and people that are buying the stuff, right?
Right.
But it's an amazingly small community, and once you're in it, and once you kind of get to know folks, and you kind of operate and actually participate, you'd be shocked at how engaged you can be.
Yeah, I love the magic of this space because of that.
Yeah, it is very good.
So I'm going to shift my questions a little bit. Would love to discuss your current role at the Global Technology Distribution Council, and how long have you been there, and what brought you to that point where you said, "Hey, at this point in my career, this is what I'm interested in doing."
Yeah, no, it's good. I spent, as I mentioned, probably 40 years on the vendor side.
Yeah.
And then I went and spent a couple of years as the CEO of a solution provider, and that turned out to be really beneficial for me because I'm one of those people that learns by doing things.
Sure.
And so as much as I thought I kind of knew that world, having been a vendor executive for a long time, working with a number of solution providers, it was an eye-opening experience. It really was. And so I spent a couple of years doing that, and it was a fairly good-sized solution provider, and it included a pretty good-sized MSP business. So
sure.
It helped me learn a little bit about what was happening there. And then I left, and I was doing some consulting, And I got contacted by the GTDC, actually by the executive committee. And the executive committee essentially are the CEOs of the 4 or 5 largest distributors on the planet.
Sure.
Ingram, Tech Data, which recently just, consolidated with.
Yeah, a lot of news around that.
Yeah, big deal. Arrow, and a company in Italy called Esprinet, the largest, one of the largest distributors in Southern Europe. And basically, GTDC is a global trade association, nonprofit trade association, and our role is to educate and advocate for the value that distributors provide in the industry. And was very, very aware of GTDC, having worked with them for years in the past. The former CEO was a gentleman named Tim Curran, who I had known for a long time. So in my role as a vendor executive, I was very engaged. So I knew what they did, knew why they did it, and it was, to me, a very exciting and interesting opportunity, and one that I could jump into, and I did. So I took the role 2 years ago.
Okay.
And it's been great. Now, clearly, the pandemic has changed, kind of changed the way I would do the job, right?
Yeah.
Quite a bit, because normally it's a lot of external, we do a couple of big events a year, and then we're doing a lot of on-site, making a lot of speeches and doing that. So that all changed, but it's still been fun. And hopefully we're going to be back to some version of normalcy, hopefully soon, right?
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. And you're reading my mind. I mean, that's literally the next thread I want to go into. Obviously, it changed how you do the job, right? Interacting with others. How are the distributors faring in the current economic environment?
Yeah, they're doing really well. We just published last week some data that showed, both in Europe and North America, the growth rates are very positive and continuing, despite, there's a few supply chain challenges right now with components and things like that. But despite that, they're doing really well. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of, how their world has changed. But before I do that, I do want to comment on what they did in 2020. 2020 was an incredible year, for the distributors. Because if you know how the distributors operate, and certainly your audience does, traditionally they've had rooms full of people, doing inside sales and technical support, et cetera. And essentially overnight with the pandemic, those people had to go someplace else.
Yeah.
They weren't in that room anymore. And so they all went home. And and that was, everybody kind of did that. But as importantly, there are also functions within distribution that wouldn't lend themselves to that. So obviously the warehousing and the logistics areas. So they had to quickly figure out what they could do there and how to continue to support their customers. And they did that. And it's incredible. The job that the distributors did throughout 2020, keeping the IT supply chain flowing, was absolutely incredible. And, if you look at other supply chains, we all heard the paper goods issues, in some cases even food supply chains. There wasn't much of that. And the distributors quickly developed a number of offerings. First of all, they figured out how to help people work from home very quickly, because and that required getting the required equipment, whether it was speakers and microphones, et cetera, laptops, but it also required training, right? And they bundled some things and they trained. But as importantly, what they did is they partnered extraordinarily well upstream with the vendors in terms of getting product to market, and then they provided a tremendous level of support, what I call downstream, to their customers, the solution providers, which included, training, support, and very importantly during the pandemic, financing programs and offerings where they extended terms, things like that proved to be really important. So I have to just say, whether I'm in this job or not, advocating for distributors, the job they did in 2020 helping, get through the worst part of the pandemic was nothing short of exceptional, frankly.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that even brings to mind, the economic impact, the stilts that, that they're putting up under, our SMB community, right? From MSPs to, all the way through the supply chain. I mean, it's hard to imagine the impact if all of that logistical planning was not happening. I mean, business doesn't move without technology anymore.
You're absolutely right. And the other thing, Ryan, that people have to understand is, even though they were forced to, react overnight, the truth is, if they didn't have 30 years of infrastructure built,
correct,
and 30 years of, all of the things that, frankly, a lot of people take for granted that distributors do, right?
Yeah.
If that all wasn't in place, they could not have morphed that quickly, right? They could not have made that transition. So you're right. They were able to do that. And, so when you sit back and you talk about, geez, what's the value that Disty provides in, sort of the old world, right?
Yeah.
Hardware oriented. And what's the value? What are they morphing to? And what's it look? Mm-hmm. You can't forget the foundation, right? In other words, that foundation's built and it isn't going away. And it's required. It's required whether we're in a cloud world or whether we're, back in 1985 worrying about getting, PCs to somebody.
Yep. Hey guys, here with a quick break from our show to remind you to subscribe and leave us a review wherever you're listening. If you have suggestions for future episodes or you want to be a guest on the podcast, email us at podcast@connectbooster.com or send us a message on Facebook or Twitter, and we'll be sure to point you in the right direction. Lastly, to find out more about our guests, check out their information in the podcast description. Thanks for listening to the Confessions of an IT Business Owner. Let's get back to the show. And you brought up a point. I mean, the role of distribution is changing a bit. We've got the underpinnings of. You're exactly right. I mean, all those years of infrastructure building. I mean, thank God. But how do you see the role of the distributor changing as MSPs, shift to the cloud and other advanced technologies and services?
Yeah. Well, it is definitely changing. And in order to really assess it, though, what you got to do is you kind of got to go back and you got to realize. So in the early days, distribution was essentially a warehouse and a bank.
Sure.
Right? That's what they did. And then it consistently evolved. And it evolved with the additions of pre- and post-sales support, solution provider recruitment and onboarding, solutions integration and technical, support. I mean, there's a whole long list of activities that makes your eyes glaze over, if I go through them all. But the truth is, they were all there, and there was a ton of value that people paid for at the vendor level when you partnered with Disty, and I did it for, as I said, more than 40 years.
Yeah.
And at the solution provider level, who are the customers of Disty's, they know all of those services.
Yeah.
And what's happened is that's consistently evolved, and it's evolved with the basics as the foundation. But now when you get into, well, what's the new world look like, right? In other words, the environment we're into, it's software and everything as a service, and certainly everything in the cloud. And the truth is, there's a whole level of support that's still required.
Correct.
And people are starting to realize that. So it isn't about, you and I, wanting to go procure a laptop and we could very easily go online and figure out, it's not about that. We're talking about businesses, enterprises continuing to, transact business. And so every solution requires multiple vendors. That's been the case forever, and that isn't going to change. The complexity is increasing, not decreasing.
Right.
With the complexity associated with the cloud and security requirements is another huge factor that everybody has to think about in any business, right? And so what's happening is you start looking at, okay, well, what value can Disty's provide I'd give you a couple of examples.
Yeah.
You look at consolidating and streamlining the ordering and the billing process.
Yeah.
I mentioned that in any solution, you're going to have multiple vendors. Well, every one of them have just different T's and C's, different
Correct.
warranties, different start dates. Somebody's got to manage all that complexity, right? Now, in some cases, the solution providers do that and can do it pretty well. But I will tell you that what I'm seeing more and more is the solution providers even are requiring a level of support from their distributors that you don't even realize until you get into it, right? And so the role is clearly evolving, it's clearly changing, but the value is not diminishing. The value is still there, and people are realizing that.
Oh, that's great information. I'm gonna take us a step, a level different, down to the MSP level. How can MSPs get the most out of their distribution relationships?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so I might have answered it differently before I actually ran an MSP.
Right, that's going to be an interesting view. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what I would tell you is, initially on the startup phase, particularly in the case of a small MSP, they might need a little bit of support, the types of things that, disties could do. But kind of once you get going, and if it's a pure play MSP, right, which I'm pretty familiar with, business is kind of going along. But what you begin to realize over time is, as you continue to evolve, your customer requirements become more significant. And so I'll give you two examples of things that I experienced as an MSP that I think are really important. The first was, I was consistently having our customers come to us asking for help with new technologies, whether it was, IoT at the time, whether it was artificial intelligence, whether it was, any number of things like that. Certainly all the cloud discussions were part of it, and all the security discussions were part of it. And what I ended up having to do was I ended up having to rely on my distributor to help me with some of that training and enablement that I couldn't afford as a relatively small MSP to go out and procure on my own, right? Because the way to do it is you basically got to go hire some people. Every one of them was a major investment that wasn't going to pay off for best case 9 to 12 months. Right. And so I had to go someplace to get it. And I went to Disti and I got it, and I got that help. The second area that was really important, and I know this might seem kind of obvious and it might seem kind of old school, but it really wasn't, was in the whole financing and creative, financial solutions area. Every distributor out there, certainly those in the part of the GTDC, offer their customers a number of different financing options. But what I found when I was running an MSP was, when I needed to go make investments, I needed to have a pool of capital that I could utilize. And all I had were my MSP contracts. And they were monthly, subscriptions. And they would be And so I had to go someplace, in addition to maybe my normal banking relationship, to find somebody that would have enough confidence and understanding of my business to help make those investments, so I could go make the investment in hiring, somebody who could take us to the next level of security, for example, or when we were morphing from an MSP to an MSSP, a managed security provider, and you had all the certifications that were required. That takes investment. And so the distributors were able to help with that and provide creative financing that enabled me to continue running my business with the cash flow I needed, but also make the investments that were required. And a lot of people don't get that. A lot of people don't understand that those options are available and those things are out there. So those are two examples that I personally experienced.
Well, and those are great points, and I think you're right that benefit of the financing element, because they understand the revenue. Like, you go to a bank, right, and they see that recurring revenue. They're not seeing it as a hard asset. They're not seeing it as, oh, this isn't land I can I can repossess that, that tangible value. They're still turning a curve to be able to understand that asset class as something that they can secure against. It's very difficult. So the ability for the distributor to understand the revenue model and to get creative, to your point, to finance against it, man, that can't be stated enough. I mean, cash flow is king in the org,
Yeah, and particularly the last couple of years, when you couple that with the pandemic situation the last couple of years, because what typically happens, in the MSP and or solution provider world, whether and many of the folks that I'm familiar with were a hybrid, right? And they were
right.
a solution provider that still sold hardware, but also had an element of services, and the services included managed services as well as professional services, right? And that combination. So when you look at that combination, it was really important that you have somebody that understands the business, right? And traditionally, folks that aren't in the space, the banking entities,
Correct,
don't understand it. Now, there is one point that I will make that is a little ancillary to all of this, but
sure.
is important to think about. The folks who have figured out the value of distribution recently have been the private equity firms, and there's a ton of investment that's been happening. And you, as I'm sure Ingram just closed, with the private equity purchase from HNA, and then of course Tech Data prior to being merging with Synex were owned by private equity, and that to me is very telling and very important for people to realize, because that's smart money. Private equity guys are smart money, and what they realized is there's a ton of value that the disties are providing, and there's more that they can be providing. Based on the investments that are being made, and so that bodes well, frankly, for where we are from an industry standpoint.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you get smart money coming into the industry like that. The future's going to be bright. They're not placing losing bets, right?
Yeah, and the distributors keep doing what they're doing, and you asked earlier, and they're doing well, and they're making investments, and they're in some cases buying other companies and consolidating, and it's a good story. It really is a good story.
Yeah, that's incredible. So you and I feel like we could talk for 3 hours with the wealth of knowledge that you've acquired through your experience and through your tenure in the industry. But I know it's the weekend. I know it's Friday, and I don't want to push you into the afternoon and our morning. Any final thoughts that you'd like to share with our listeners before we end the show?
Yeah, here's what I would say. And for me, as I said, in my current role, which is to educate the marketplace on what distribution does, what I would urge your audience to do is to spend time to understand the offerings that are available to help them with their business through distribution. The worst statement that any distributor wants to hear from a solution provider or a prospective customer is, "Gee, I didn't know you did that."
Right.
That's the last thing they want to hear, right?
Right.
But yet sometimes, like any other business, we don't all do a good enough job articulating, what can be done, because it ranges from a laundry list of activities that, as I said earlier, can make your eyes glaze over, to tell us what you need and we'll do it, which also puts some people off sometimes, right? Because sometimes people want, well, what is the solution that you have for this or for that? And so my advice would be, ask the question, go and get engaged, understand what the distributor can provide very specifically, and they'll be surprised. And they'll be surprised on the good side, because their offerings are incredible, and they've made incredible advances over the last couple of years in this new world that we're living in, of everything as a service, and software and cloud, and all the other things that are happening from an advanced technology standpoint. So that would be my advice.
That's great advice. call to action, guys. Get out and create that relationship with your distributors and start having that conversation on where you can help each other out, in business, driving solutions down to those end customers. That's great. Frank, it was an honor to have you on today. I truly do appreciate, and I'm really grateful for you spending your time with us today. Thanks for all of the information you shared with the audience. Extremely valuable, as well as just a really fun look into your experience in the industry as well. This was great. Appreciate the time.
Well, great, Ryan. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoy it, and I'll be happy to do it again as things go on. Because the one thing we all know, being in this industry, is it's going to change. It's
Correct.
going to continue to evolve. So that's probably why it's so much fun.
Well, I am sure we will be talking again.
Yep. Thanks.
Thank you.